Today, my talk is titled Language and Work, and it completes chapter 13 titled Center and Periphery. I thought I would jump right into this part of the chapter and review previous concepts when it seems appropriate, as well as bring in important related topics from other chapters. I feel like this may be the most important chapter in the book. First, a few disclaimers. I know many of the concepts in this book and in this talk, but some I don't know them fully in my bones yet. It's a work in progress. Maybe you know them on a deeper level, which is great. If not, maybe they will help you in some capacity. If not, that's okay too. There are many quotes from Albert Lowe. As I said before, he may be quoting other people, and I try to reference that as much as possible. But I think you'll recognize my words, and this book was written back in the 70s, so it's very, the terminology, the pronouns, it's male dominated. I reference Krishnamurti, he worked the same way, and I try to mix and blend, but please keep that in mind. And it's humans, I think is what we all are saying here, human beings. I want to emphasize my appreciation in being able to give this talk and the time and energy you're taking to listen to it. There aren't a lot of examples for me personally in terms of how it relates to my experience. The biggest one is the process of preparing for the talk and what it's, been like being so fascinated with this topic. It's very much related to our topics today, which is language and work. And so if you have any questions about my process, feel free to contact me. I'd be happy to share them with you. Questions did come up for me in this talk. I may not voice them, some I might. Still, I kept hoping for an idea that would lead to a product and a formal Dharma talk, but it never came. In the end, it's just to talk about language and work, so to speak. So here we go. Now, at the end of my last talk, or the second part of this chapter, the process of projection was briefly brought up. Albert Lowe writes, "The avoidance of responsibility is what the psychologist calls projection." And he's referencing Freudian psychology, which is talked about in the second part of this particular chapter, and how it differs from Zen. This is what Albert Lowe says about projection. We project because of a conflict within ourselves due to the struggle between being as center and being as periphery, known as the basic polarity. This psychological projection is what makes us different from animals. We're not different from animals in terms of having the center periphery reality. Animals know that there are entities out there that are separate from them. He writes, "The animal, however, is unable to express the duality through language. Animals communicate." A recent New York Times article talked about how we mostly get it wrong about what our dogs are communicating to us. Language apparently is not needed to communicate. Animals do other things like pair up, create and defend territory, and rely on hierarchy to deal with the basic polarity they surely face. Not only with others outside of themselves, but within themselves. Humans superimpose language onto communication. Humans project. So one of the things I'm getting more and more interested in is definitions in Latin. It helps me psychologically, I think. It gets to the root of things a little bit more. So the definition of projection is a throwing forward. The primary polarity humans face has different causes and even names, depending on who you reference. Rather than the struggle being experienced over time, as many have believed, including and believe still, including the references used in Freudian psychology concepts. Albert Lowe says, again, it is within us naturally. It is created within us naturally. He says the primary polarity is projected through language as the primary word. Every major language has the subject, verb, object split. In a minute, you will see a diagram that describes this. It is said that a young child learning their mother tongue achieves something special through this splitting. However, the real achievement is the coalescing or making sense of it all. The struggle or tension we experience as being human is expressed through language. He uses many sources, including Noam Chomsky, Oswald Spengler, and Arthur Koestler. So you see the I, it's references the primordial idea that could not be, has not been expressed yet, the intention of saying something, an image like a geometric shape or a mathematical equation, a past memory or something about the future, fantasy, sensation, feeling. Earlier in the chapter, he writes, so just to go back a second, you see the split that takes place here, noun phrase and verb phrase. The subject is the noun phrase, the verb phrase is the verb and the object. So the splitting and coalescing. So earlier in the chapter, Lowe writes, the will or id is divided against itself. And this gives rise to the basic conflict. This conflict is reconciled by the primordial idea that we just talked about. And out of this idea, time, space, and therefore existence becomes possible. Later on, we will revisit the concept of will and break down the process into parts that may shed some light on things. How is knowing about this helpful when we can't or don't necessarily see this happening in real time? We might get some clues if we understand the dilemma a bit more. Again, back to Latin, dilemma. Die is two. Lemma is an assumption or premise. When I looked up on the internet, two premises came up. And when you have two premises and facing a dilemma, you don't necessarily like either choice, but you choose between the best choice. Well, Albert Lowe referenced these points that the dilemma has, he called it two horns, but he described it as having four horns. And I believe that is a component of Zen. And I'll go into that a little bit later. If you look at the Latin words, definitions of assumption and premise, assumption is taken up and premise is to send before. So I imagine, a committee taking up a dilemma or, send before the committee or send before the court, the dilemma. I covered the dilemma, aka the basic polarity, briefly in my original book review, but the author says that mental work is all about facing and resolving dilemmas, and he gave some examples. But Lowe asked whether a general principle could be developed related to all jobs. Here's what he said. If so, one would get a paradigm that could be used as a means of identifying the particular dilemma underlying any particular work. This would make the dilemma conscious. At present, a manager must deal with the dilemma at an unconscious level, and therefore inarticulate level. The solutions she comes to may be correct, but because they are inarticulate, they cannot be communicated, nor often are they as simple as they could be if they were exposed to the light of conscious reason. So these are four horns that you could use for a way to deal with a particular dilemma that you're facing. I used this when I was preparing from the book review, to see if I could keep it simple, complete, pragmatic meant it worked, at least for me, and it was communicable. Some of these are antagonistic to each other. Some are strongly antagonistic. Some are weakly antagonistic, and some are complementary. And he also uses an XY graph to compare these to cost and value or quality, cost and quality. When you use less cost, you sacrifice cost for higher quality, or you sacrifice quality for higher, lower cost. Did I say that right? If you sacrifice cost, meaning it's more expensive, you get higher quality. If you sacrifice quality, it's lower cost. The two examples he uses is, or one of them at least, is a customer service call, where you have to potentially send out a service truck to deal with the problem at the customer site, and that takes money as costs. So the customer service agent tries to weigh whether, offering higher quality service or keeping costs down, and quality might suffer. So I'll talk a little bit more later about dilemma, but this explanation helped me potentially answer the question of whether I'm getting too technical for my own good. Maybe knowing about our process of projection and language may help us become more conscious in our use of language. It seems language changes every 20 years or so, even faster. It's dynamic. It makes it tricky for people to keep up. Feelings are hurt. Misunderstandings abound. Here's where the talk gets a little bit technical and abstract. As I mentioned, sometimes I get it, sometimes it comes to me, and then I lose it, it comes back. See if we can let it roll over us. Just a gentle reminder that in the beginning of the chapter, the first part of the book talked more about the structure and process of the organization in order to produce a product. It is more static. The book now is moving into a more dynamic phase. He said it was important for managers, although not to have to be an expert, but to understand the human condition. When we understand ourselves, we understand our colleagues, people who we relate to, and organizations that are made up of other people. Also, there's a part that's relevant to a main piece of the talk, in fact, the last part of the talk, that describes a process that is available to all of us. I will point out this section at the end of the technical section. Desire or will, and I'm looking at these as very similar or even the same, as the author says, manifests as the two modes of being, center and periphery. They can't be experienced, but it gives rise to the conflict being reconciled, and thus is the source of experience. Experience is therefore polarized and has for its basic poles perception and action. Spoiler alert, this is the important part. It's perception and action, but it's described at the end of this technical section. We'll break it down into parts and so we can slow it down, see it visually, and analyze it. There's 5 parts here that I'm going to break down, 4 or 5 parts that I'm going to break these into, starting with Janice. So will is a hold-on. It's Janus shaped. It's dynamic. We're limited not only in the words that we use, but in the images that we use. This looks 2-dimensional, but it's really 3-dimensional, or it's dynamic. It has characteristics of being both a part and a whole. An organization is a hold-on in that in its integrative centering tendency, it is a whole. When we think we are the center of the universe, it feels like there is a wholeness. But it also has an expansive, assertive aspect. It is a part of a wider whole, society within which its assertion is felt. Will is the urge towards self-actualization. The will or id, which is the source of those unknown and uncomfortable forces by which we are lived. That to me sounds very Zen. We are being lived. Will is individual and cannot be divided. But the two modes of being are mutually exclusive, and consequently a conflict is inherent within will, the basic polarity. The will and the 2 inferior principles, a supernal triad, are not existing, but form the source of existence. I mentioned in the previous talk, the middle part of this chapter, that was kind of an eye-opener for me, and it where something is not something, but it's the source. It is something, but it's not It's something, but not something else. But it's the source of something else. But what it is can't necessarily be experienced, but it is the source of experience. You notice the bottom part there of the slide. There's a third mode of being. There's a striving because of this conflict, this tension. There's a striving to reblend into a whole. It is one and undivided, but it's divided against itself. And so there's this striving to reblend into a whole. This structure is the structure of being the center and being the periphery. However, insofar as the two inferior principles have a structure that can be revealed, they can be considered to be. The structure is the structure of being the center and being the periphery. In a future slide, you're going to see where I believe Zen comes in and where Albert Lowe is talking about for a dilemma, instead of 2 horns, is 4 horns. A dilemma is a paradox. And there's this tension that, you have the structure and the process of an organization, of us, the center and periphery. Being the center is the structure, being the periphery is the process. But here we have structure for both being the center and being the periphery. But you say, wait a minute, being the periphery is the process. So to me, there's this where they're not the same, but they're not different. So in the structure, being the center, being the periphery is part of the structure. And in the process, being the center and being the periphery is in the process as well. That's my take on this. There is a third mode of being, as I mentioned, due to this striving to be whole, being of existence. And you notice the definition of existence, Latin definition, ex sistere, which to stand outside of. We perceive and we act. The importance of this simple observation will be seen at the end of the talk, as I mentioned. Now, there's another description of projection in this next slide. It has to do around time and space. As we mentioned, this is dynamic. Organizations are dynamic, we're dynamic. There's different dimensions, planes. Going back to structure and process, structure is connected to time or references time. process references space. Structure and process, as mentioned throughout the book and at the beginning of this chapter, are self-limitations of will. So, we that is within ourselves, but you can see that in an organization. There are limitations, and limits is a big topic in this book. Like an artist needs limits around what they're doing, otherwise it's not a quote unquote art. So a question asked, do we put these limitations on ourselves naturally? Is it a conscious thought? So experience has as its framework time and space. And so those are self-limitations. This is where those moments where what I like to do is just pause a little bit, maybe read it. And yet these in turn are projections of the intensive, extensive modes of the whole on of humans. They arise out of the self-limitation of will. So experience has as its framework time and space. They arise out of the self-limitation of will, out of this conflict, the coalescing, the working out of the conflict. Time and space is the structure, but also the coalescing, the structure and process, the coalescing creates time. So to me, that's a paradox. As I've mentioned in previous talks, perhaps the most interesting part of the book comes with the concept of a product. This product comes from an idea, but put into form and where there is a demand. He says when talking about language, the word arises through the possibility inherent in humans to project, and therefore to hypostatize, and thereby neutralize the primary duality. But the word, the fact, only becomes such when it is received. To me, received is like demand. So he posits that the product that organizations make, that we humans make, is done in the basic formation of language, even in basic sentences. Compare this to a product that we make, a meal, taking a loved one to a doctor's appointment, walking the dog, navigating traffic, saying our first words and sentences. In the next slide, you will see the image of a product which includes ideas put into form with a demand. But you will also see where the author, I believe, uses Zen, paradox, basic polarity to bring his point across. You will see arrows pointing in and out at the edges of the triangle. This references not only the outer edges, the periphery, but also towards the center. These arrows represent tension and they give the center and periphery its strength. So there's tension even there in the center, in the product. And again, this is dynamic. This, images can only, on a computer screen, can only go so far. So we are creating products as we learn our mother tongue. Think about how natural it becomes to us and how conditioned we are. Language appears to be the launching point of this product, creating that we humans do. People say they are humbled, sometimes when they are admitted to a respected club or achieve some goal. Well, this to me seems humbling. We don't have to think about making products. More and more, it reminds me to be more compassionate to myself and others. Several articles in the New York Times recently have talked about language and artificial intelligence. One was about geometric shapes and how it may make humans different from animals. And in this particular study, how baboons couldn't identify geometric shapes, although they could identify an image of apple slices on the kiosk computer screen, since they receive apple slices as a reward for things, perhaps for things like picking out an apple slice image on a computer screen, amongst others. In the last line of the article, one of the researchers was positing that language may have originally started out as a representation device to represent facts rather than a communication device. Another article was about mathematics, a language in itself. One was about animals, about how every creature on earth exists in its own unique perceptual world. The writer references philosopher Thomas Nagel's 1974 classic essay, "What is it like to be a bat?" I personally think it is hard enough to describe what it's like to be human. However, this use of language only goes so far. We hear it in Zen. Krishnamurti said the word is not the thing. Thought is always delayed, he would say. Words can only point to what reality is like. Last week, I watched all 4 episodes of Michael Pollan's Mind on Plants on Netflix. LSD, psilocybin or psilocybin, MDMA or ecstasy, and peyote. In one of the episodes, an older woman with cancer and a Roman Catholic was facing existential fears about death and guilt. During her trip, she remembered a miscarriage in her early 20s and felt responsible. The Virgin Mary came to her during her trip and told her, "I will take care of your baby." When asked later about this, she said, "There are no words." Another woman in the LSD episode was asked to describe her experience and said, "Well, I couldn't possibly describe it. Don't you see it?" Now, I'm not for or against using psychedelic drugs, but it appears these experiences help people see that words and language are limited in describing the human experience. The reconciliation of the basic polarity only goes so far. Underlying the deliverance, therefore, is the threat, and the threat can only be overcome by labor. Humans were innocent in the Garden of Eden until eating the fruit of the tree that was to be desired to make one wise. So there's this, and this is from Genesis 3:6. This is not the author's words, but there's this desire to be knowledgeable, to know. Since humans first created language, they have struggled to overcome the tyranny of their own creation. I want to mention a few things about projection and dilemma before we wrap up. The word project comes from Latin, as I mentioned earlier. It means thrown forward. The word problem comes from Greek. The Latin and Greek meanings for both project and problem are to throw forward or something thrown at you. I first heard this description of problem from Krishnamurti, who differentiated problems from facts. He said the brain is trained in problems, to always be looking for problems. Has it always been this way? That our creation is a problem? That our ability to project, to throw out or away helps us look at things as problems? Sometimes this is helpful to learn a language, drive a car, space exploration, working together in teams to create a vaccine. But when it moves into the psychological realm, it is not. But conditioning all the while. So then we look at fact or form. The two are interchangeable with Albert Lowe, apparently. Krishnamurti encouraged us to look at things as facts, not problems, as I mentioned. Facts wither away if we let them. Problems are something that we toil with. But problems are rarely, or if at all, are we faced with something thrown at us. We think they're thrown at us, though. Another mention about projection and dilemma. As I mentioned earlier about what Lowe said, the creation of language was the original sin. This is from the Bible. Its promise was paradise, the price eternal labor. In fact, I'm not sure if that's actually, that might be his words. I think it's a metaphor. Here is what Lowe wrote in the chapter, The Dilemma. The work situation has great psychological value. Through work, we are able to escape the effects of the dilemma by projecting it into the work situation. In a well-organized situation, the dilemma is, as it were, caged, and we are able to enjoy its power without seemingly paying its price. Work is not the invention of the West. Our contribution has been to deify work. Industrial work is our answer to a religionless society. In past societies, religion provided the source of work, of humans' work. And through spiritual work, religion showed man or humans, women, how to go beyond the dilemma. The mandala of the Buddhists and the cross of the Christians can be seen to be the symbol of the conflicting forces to which we are subject and the degree of suffering that these forces can create. He says, Zen, more than any other spiritual discipline, invites us to seek the heart of the primordial dilemma in a way that does not destroy its potential. That positive tension. And one thing we don't talk about in terms of work is so many benefits. Confidence, acceptance, being in the tribe. But also, as as Albert Lowe points out, psychologically, spiritually, physically, working out this conflict within ourselves. It, my opinion, helps us perceive. Possibly related to this is something I found interesting, was the follow-up to this book is his 2008 book, Conflict and Creativity at Work. It didn't include any chapters on Zen other than references. Maybe this is one of the reasons why he removed the Zen chapters for the follow-up book. We deify work in a way that doesn't leave room for religions as we did in the past. A recent book titled Work, Pray, Code, When Work Becomes Religion by Carolyn Chen, a sociologist and associative professor at UC Berkeley points to this. In the first chapter of the book, he writes, "The role of a manager is not simply to solve problems, but also to resolve dilemmas." Perhaps my favorite quote this time around, or maybe even in the whole book, Albert Lowe writes, "To do mental work, it is necessary to face and resolve a dilemma. And it is because of this that work is hard. If there were no dilemma, there would be no mental work. But because there is a dilemma, work is necessary." So I will end with a final note about language and how it relates to work. Plus, there is a possible solution in meditation, or a way of looking at meditation. It might give us something to think about and even work on, but not in the traditional Silicon Valley sense. He writes, "Perception ends in an idea, intellect in a logical formulation. Perception, therefore, concerns itself with a totality, with a whole, while the intellect concerns itself with parts. Perception concerns itself with the idea, the intellect with the fact that expresses that idea. Perception is immediate, timeless. Intellect is in time. It passes through stages. We can't really take claim of our ideas. That is true for someone even like Einstein, Steve Jobs, Mother Teresa, Oprah Winfrey, even the Buddha. The perception of ideas is best termed a cosmic organic process," he writes, "and that ideas are conceived in the cosmos, but perceived in the organism. When we make products, ideas come to us. They don't come logically or thinking them through. That is for later down the line when we put words to our actions." So these concepts are related to each other. Perception, action, as I mentioned, that's a very important concept. I'll mention it in a minute. Idea leads to fact, structure and process, center, periphery, capacity, ability, which I believe is a future topic. So finally, I will end with what else? Another Albert Lowe quote from the chapter Zen, Creativity Through the Dilemma. "But when the practitioner becomes adept, the stress and effort is transformed into tautness, and the mind becomes like a drawn bow. As long as there is no reconciling idea, the mind is in a state of alert readiness. Drowsiness does occur, but this is a condition that comes from falling away from the tautness. The mind is perceiving. In other words, it is fully active, but there is no content to the perceiving other than the act of perception itself. The act of perception is not a separate, discrete act. It is the condition of wholeness and completeness that is the birthright of each of us." So I mentioned that questions did come up for me. I think I'll mention a few here since we have a little bit more time. is the knowledge and understanding, as he referenced, kind of was referring to a biblical idea, the desire to make one wise. We all want to know. By knowing, we'll feel maybe more secure. So how does that help us, and how does it get in the way? By helping us, again, it helps us survive. It also helps us, there's I've mentioned this to other people, a jewel in the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. There's a 12-step process to get unstuck. And one of those is that the solution to getting unstuck will not come to us logically when we're stuck. But Robert Pirsig also said that you have to know something about the subject, you have to have a feel for it. And so I believe when we get technical, when we're understanding things, when we study koans, it helps us get a feel for it. It may not help us ultimately to get it. It's going to come to us without us expecting it, but it helps us get a feel for it. I have a question here. What is so appealing about it? Why has this grabbed me so much, this book? I believe that Albert Lowe is an expert in koans. If you go to his website, albertlowe.ca, there are a lot of books. Some of them are ebooks, but there are a lot of books on koans. So I believe this book is one big koan. But breaking it down, dilemma, when we face dilemmas in our life, which, all of us do in work and personal life, could argue that everything is a dilemma. It's a paradox. So maybe that's why it's so appealing to me. On the downside of getting too technical, again, it's not going to come to us logically. And language becomes outdated, technology becomes outdated, it's limited, as Krishnamurti said. Anyway, thank you very much.